This is the original Nintendo Game Boy line, the DMG, the Game Boy Pocket, and the Game Boy Light. Now what do all of these Game Boys have in common? Well, it's quite simple, really. You can't play them on the TV. It's the Super Game Boy 2 for Super Famicom. Hey guys, what's going on? RetroGamer here, and welcome back to another review featuring the Super Game Boy 2. So this little device right here is the Super Game Boy 2. Now for those of you who grew up in the West, much like myself, you might be a little confused, thinking, I had a Super Game Boy, but I didn't know that they had it too. Well, unfortunately, this was only released in Japan. Now, the original Super Game Boy was such a cool device. It plugged into your Super Nintendo and allowed you to play Game Boy original games. You know, you just plugged in any game like Tetris in the top, and then you could output it to your TV, and it was such a cool device. That was released in 1994, and then in 1998, this is 2 years into the Nintendo 64, Nintendo decided to release the Super Game Boy 2. So, what are the differences between the two? I don't have the original to show you on hand, unfortunately, but the Super Game Boy 2 is basically like the definitive Super Game Boy. The original Super Game Boy was really good, but the Super Game Boy 2 adds on to that. So, on the surface, it doesn't look like much. You have a new clear case, and it adds the EXT port for 2-player or for hooking up the Game Boy printer and stuff like that, which was a really nice feature. And in the main menu when you get into a game, it has the new overlays as well as the old overlays. So you're not losing anything from the Super Game Boy 2. And on top of that, this is completely compatible with a US Super Nintendo. See, the thing about the Super Nintendo, and I don't have a US Super Nintendo, unfortunately, but I have the Super Famicom, which is the Japanese variant. You'll see in here that on a Super Nintendo, you'll have these plastic tabs on the inside of the cartridge slot, and if you take those out, with just pliers you can just twist and break them, you can fit any Famicom cartridge in there, and it'll run fine. That's the only way they region locked those devices. It's same with the Nintendo 64. There were these tabs, and if you take them out, you can play Japanese games. They aren't region locked devices, they're only region locked through the cartridge slot. Interesting way to do region locking though, that's for sure. But other than that, on the surface, it doesn't look like there's a huge difference. The really big difference though is the clock speed. See, the Super Game Boy, the original, ran off of the Super Nintendo clock speed, which is 2.4% faster than the original Game Boy. And I'm going to be honest with you, it is not much. Like, you're really not going to notice. I didn't know that. You're not going to notice. I've seen side-by-side shots of the Super Game Boy and Super Game Boy 2 running. It is barely noticeable. But it is nice to have the actual correct clock speed and have the games run correctly. In speed running, you can't use the original Super Game Boy because they run faster. You have to use the Super Game Boy 2. But you're not losing anything playing the Super Game Boy 2 versus the original. This is the definitive way to play. Now, you would think to yourself, well, this is clear cartridge, so, man, this thing must play Game Boy Color games. It does not. That's a really big bummer. The fact that this thing did not play Game Boy Color games, that's a bummer, especially in 1998. That's when the Game Boy Color came out. But I have a couple different ideas as to why they didn't do that. My first idea is maybe they couldn't get it to work on the Super Nintendo. Second idea is maybe it was too costly. And my third idea is maybe they didn't want to compete against themselves. The Super Game Boy 2 and Game Boy Color, they came out the same year. So maybe they didn't want to compete against themselves with the Game Boy Color and Super Game Boy 2. Those could all be wrong, but I tried my best thinking of why they didn't do that. But this can still only play original Game Boy games or those black Game Boy cartridges that work with the Game Boy Color and original Game Boy. But the exclusive ones, the clear cartridge Game Boy Color games like Pokemon Crystal and stuff like that, they will not play in this. That's unfortunate. But also what they released is Hori released this Super Game Boy controller in Japan. Now, as far as my knowledge goes, they have never released this in the United States. If they did, please let me know. But as far as I know, they released this in Japan for the Super Game Boy. And it is a super cool controller. It's really cool. It looks like the original DMG Game Boy. Let me grab it here. It's just right over here to the side. Like, look, it's like it is like 1-to-1. It's super cool. It's like it's just an original Game Boy like controller, and while it's cool, it's not that comfortable to actually play with. The problem I find is these two buttons are just a little too far spaced out, and you can't really press the button right when you're like running like Super Mario Land and stuff. Like if you're playing like Pokemon and stuff, it works completely fine, which is what I've been doing. I've been grinding Pokemon Silver like crazy. I love that game so much. It's my first experience playing it, and I've been playing on Super Game Boy too. It is super fun. But you know, like platform and stuff, it's not that the buttons just put them a little bit closer, man. It's such a cool controller. You can use an original controller. Like if you have like a Super Nintendo controller or a Super Famicom controller, they work just fine. But I thought it would be really cool to have a Super Game Boy controller, and it is cool. But I'm gonna be honest, the original controller works a lot better just because these are spaced out just a little too far. But you can see right here that it has a Super Game Boy mode and a Super Famicom mode. So all of the buttons are still here. The L and R and X and Y buttons are all still here, so you can use it as a standard Super Famicom controller. If you wish to do that, I don't recommend it, but it is a really cool controller. And the cord is twice as long as the Super Famicom. Those are like 3 feet. This is like the original length of a Super Nintendo controller. It's like 6 feet or something like that. This is way longer than the Super Famicom controller, so that's why I do like using it, because it's a lot longer of a cord. Other than that, there's really not too much more I have to say on the Super Game Boy 2. I highly recommend this thing, though. I said it's region free. You can play Japanese Game Boy games and American Game Boy games on here, and it works in the American Super Nintendo if you take out those tabs. If you do not want to take out those tabs for whatever reason, no one's going to look in there, man. Just take them out. But if you don't want to mess up your Super Nintendo, or you want to keep it pure, you can buy an adapter as well to play Super Famicom games, and then it'll just boot right up. I would highly recommend this thing. These go anywhere from like $45 to $60 on eBay, which is really not a bad price. The Super Game Boy goes for like, I think like 25 or something. But this is the definitive way to play Super Game Boy. If you're looking to play Super Game Boy, I would highly recommend getting the Super Game Boy 2. But guys, that was my review on the Super Game Boy 2. So guys, RetroGamer, if you liked the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you guys back here with another review. See you guys then.